Hi everyone, welcome to our rendering teardown section. My name is Simon. Today we're going to have a look at the first image of 2018. So let's get started. As you can see, we're dealing with a really nice multi-housing project in a nice landscaped area. So the project is really simple, but definitely, like, the image is definitely interesting to work on. First thing we can say regarding the composition is that we have like a really simple and efficient composition where you have this amount of sort of mass that sort of leads your eye to look at this facade here, which is a good thing because you still have interesting details in the vegetation, but you're still focusing your attention on the projects, which is, well, what we're sort of looking for. The second thing that is interesting is that you have a really good portion of sky in your image, which is really important because if we, for example, had a crop that would be much lower like that, you can see we would feel a little bit more in the project, but it would also feel more crammed because the more negative space you have, the more light you sort of feel and the more light the render feels like. Tiny thing that could be a little bit problematic and that sort of occurs to me now is that this facade seems to be straight in the middle of your image. It's not really a huge problem, but you might have to rebalance it a little bit because it looks a lot like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But still, I think we can balance it just with the lighting. So regarding the lighting, you can see we have something interesting is that this is a dark area, this is a light area, and we have the dark areas here in between. So this is really interesting because most of the time what I see is that people tend to have the sun basically in their back or something like that, and both facades are lit, which means your architecture is going to look extremely flat. But in this case, we have nice cast shadows and core shadows that are divided in two things. First, we have the cast shadow here, which is from the foliage that we have here. And this is really interesting. Every time you have vegetation, try to get nice cast shadows visible to sort of create a foreground or anything possible, because it'll always be extremely soft and interesting because it's going to be quite contrasting with the architecture cast shadows you get here, for example, which are a little bit more sharper and less sort of organic. In terms of lighting, again, we can still see that if we switch to black and white, there's a kind of a lack of contrast. So we're going to have a look at that a little bit later on, but I just wanted to, like, as you can see, this is a little bit too, like, you could contrast it a little bit more. Another thing that we can talk about is the detailing. Here you can see the model is actually quite good. There are many small details that are quite interesting, and there are some other areas that could have been a little bit better. In terms of good points, there are all the frames here, window frames, that I find really convincing. You could have like a little bit more of detail, but still this amount of detail is already a really good start, because most of the time we usually have just a simple rectangle extruded and it just doesn't work and it's not convincing at all. The only drawback in this is that you can see that the animation between each behind each frame is a simple curtain, and even though this is always better than nothing, it would still be quite interesting to take the time to delete a couple of curtains and try to detail a little bit of what's happening behind inside the apartment. So it could be like a painting on a wall with the top of a sofa and a little lamp or television, or just a couple of stuff hanging on the wall. It doesn't have to be complicated, it just have to be a little bit convincing, and that way you're going to have a bit more variety in your windows. Same goes with this kind of windows, which is something you kind of want to avoid, because the main problem you usually have as a buyer is that you think that what's happening at the ground floor is you're always gonna have to close your curtain and nothing's gonna happen here because there's too many people passing by and you don't want to see what's happening inside of it. So what you want to do is actually try to show that you can actually live here on the ground floor, and maybe there's like a table here and people eating something or having a drink or whatever, and maybe there's just a football here or whatever. Just try to animate it a little bit. You don't have to cram it with people or anything, but just sort of give the idea that there's actually life happening in your building. Because here, even though the framing is okay, the lighting is okay, there's still like the idea that it's a little bit lifeless because there's no inside, so it looks more like a facade rather than an actual project with people living in it. Anyway, the other thing regarding details that is quite important is the cladding system here. You can see it's that's the thing, is like you can see it's actually just a texture, because there's no, like, the edge here is extremely sharp, whereas you should have like a tiny bit of bump for each plank. So once the easiest way is actually to use a plugin that lets you change like a plane into planks, so something like floor generator or stuff like that. Because the problem you'll have if you're working, like if you're modeling the whole thing and then your client says actually the plank is not like 10 centimeters high by 20 or 25 or whatever. The thing is, if it's less flexible, so find the best way you can, but still it would add a great deal of realism if you actually model each plank. And the other thing is that in terms of textures, it's going to be much easier to have a set of, say, 10 to 20 planks, and then slightly change the gamma and the saturation to sort of have a lot of variety. Whereas if you were just applying a simple texture, you're going to see the tiling somehow. So that's it. Another thing is the texture of this cube here, which is a little bit too simple. You might want to play a little bit with the add a dirt map and have a tiny variation in the glossiness or in the bump map or in the reflection map, because here at the moment it doesn't look like it's reflecting anything. And since it's quite a light color and it's supposed to be like a quite generic material, it's gonna have to reflect a little bit the light that is coming from this side. Same goes actually for the wood here, which is a little bit too dull and not enough reflective, I think. Tiny detail here, but this shadow might be a little tiny bit distracting, so you might want to get rid of it. In terms of vegetation, I think everything is working quite well. You have nice variation, and the grass is quite convincing. This part here is a little bit problematic to my taste. You might want to redo the transition between the paving and sort of pathway here. If it's sort of a sand, you might want to have like a bit of sand on the paving, or just something a little bit less abrupt than this. And in terms of tiling, again, there's this thing that is extremely repetitive, which is not a good thing, of course. So what you want to do is just get a special UV map for each stick here, so that they don't all look the same. So that's it. I'm gonna proceed a little bit differently than usual and do the changes quite quickly, but without recording them. Or actually I might record them, but just accelerate them either way. I'm gonna do it without commenting, but I'm just gonna work on what I just said, and then I'm gonna come back to every single stuff I did so that you have a better look at how I did it. If we quickly have a look at what I've just done, we can... It was really simple. The first thing was regarding the overall contrast, because as I said, when you look at it in black and white, it's a little bit too, like, it lacks a bit of contrast. So here's a adjustment curve here that sort of makes this facade stand out a little bit and basically contrast the image a bit. Here's the usual burn and dodge tool here, so we can put some, like, emphasize the path here and the grass, which is really nice, like the discrepancy between this part here and this part here is quite interesting. Like you can see here, it's way more interesting that way. The other thing here is the burn tool. That is quite interesting, especially for this kind of area here, where you have, like, the wood I was referring to. Having different planks is quite important if you want it to look realistic. So playing around with the burn tool, you can sort of add a bit of a variety in the way the wood ages. Sorry. So that could be interesting. Here I added a couple of, like, god rays, but really, well, really subtle. They could actually, like, I could actually lower the opacity a little bit more. So the idea is just to bring a bit of different lighting style. Final thing was regarding because you can see here, one of the problem we had is that the image is quite saturated, especially the wood here and the grass. So it's something you want to change a bit. So what I did is just to make a hue and saturation adjustment layer. So as you can see here, it sort of decreases the saturation. There's like a mask here, so it's not everywhere. I've mostly used it on the grass and the vegetation because it always looked weird to have, like, such saturated green. Like, you can have it, but still I usually try to temper it down a bit because it's usually a bit too saturated. This is just the shadow I was referring to that is a bit bothering me. And also I changed the sky, because here you can see we had a really simple sky. So oftentimes it's really interesting to have really simple sky. The thing is, in our case, you might want to have still, like, a tiny bit of like something happening, but as you can see, it's really subtle. Like, the difference is really simple. There's just this one thing, like, I did the mask a little bit too quick, So, whoops, this could go like that. So we can get a bit of clouds here and there, which is interesting. And the good thing is that this sort of sky could be reflected inside your glazing here. So in the same way that you can get, interesting reflection here with the vegetation, you could get a little bit more interesting reflection with maybe a cloud here and there. So that would be it. So as you can see, it's really simple changes, but it can go a long way in making it a little bit more interesting. So I guess that's it for today. Of course, you would have to fine-tune many small things, but like, I guess the lighting is a little bit more convincing that way. I think I'll stop right there. And well, hopefully you've learned some interesting tips and tricks regarding lighting and a couple of things to keep in mind when you're doing some facade system and what are the kind of details you have to pay attention to. And I'll see you in the next teardown. Thank you guys. Bye.
Schneider.